10,000 years before Rome laid its first stone, before Egypt raised its first pyramid, a world rose from the mud between two rivers and invented civilization itself. Writing, law, cities, empire. None of these existed anywhere on Earth until Mesopotamia willed them into being. This is the complete story. From the first Neolithic farmers pressing seeds into rain-fed soil along the Zagros foothills, to the rise of Uruk, the largest city the ancient world had ever known. From Sargon of Akkad forging the first empire through force and cunning, to the vast bureaucratic machinery of Ur that counted every grain and every laborer on clay. From Hammurabi's laws carved into black basalt, to the terror of Assyrian armies marching from the Tigris to the Nile. From the gleaming Ishtar Gate of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, to the quiet afternoon when Cyrus of Persia walked through its open doors and ended 4,000 years of independent Mesopotamian power. We will walk through the temples, the markets, the scribal schools. We will witness how farmers, priests, merchants, kings, and slaves built and sustained a world that kept reinventing itself across millennia. Every time you glance at a clock divided into 60 minutes, every time you read a line of written text, every time a court of law delivers a verdict based on recorded code, you are living inside Mesopotamia's legacy. If you enjoy complete journeys through the rise and fall of civilizations, subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Each week we bring you the full story of a world that shaped history. Let us begin where it all began, with the land itself. The land is flat. That is the first thing to understand. A vast alluvial plain stretching south and east from the foothills of the Zagros Mountains to the marshes of the Persian Gulf, split by two rivers flowing roughly parallel toward the sea. The Tigris, faster and deeper, cuts through the eastern plain. The Euphrates, slower, wider, more prone to wandering its banks, traces the western edge. Between them lies a corridor of silt deposited over millions of years by seasonal flooding, soil so rich it is almost black, yet in a climate so dry that almost nothing grows without human intervention. This is the land that will become Mesopotamia. But 10,000 years before the Common Era, it has no name. No cities stand here, no canals cross its surface. The southern plain is marsh and dry scrub, uninhabited, waiting. The story begins not on the plain itself, but in the arc of highlands curving north and east, the Fertile Crescent. Here, where the Taurus and Zagros ranges catch winter rainfall, wild wheat and barley grow on hillsides without cultivation. Wild sheep, goats, and cattle graze in foothill meadows. In the centuries following the end of the last ice age, as temperatures rise and rainfall patterns stabilize, small bands of hunter-gatherers begin to linger in these zones longer than before. At Chayonu, in southeastern Anatolia, oval stone dwellings cluster together around 9,500 years before the Common Era. At Jarmo, in the foothills of the Iraqi Zagros, a community of perhaps 150 people cultivates emmer wheat and two-row barley by around 7,000 before the Common Era, living in mud-brick houses with stone foundations and storing grain in clay-lined pits dug into packed earth floors. These are not yet cities. They are not yet even villages as later ages would understand the term. But something irreversible has begun. The decision to plant, to tend, to harvest, to store, this binds people to place. Obsidian blades chipped from volcanic glass traded south from Anatolian sources appear at sites hundreds of kilometers from their origin. Groundstone tools, mortars, pestles, polished axes replace the flaked implements of mobile hunters. Pottery emerges, first crude and undecorated, then increasingly refined. The Hassuna culture, appearing across northern Mesopotamia around 6000 before the Common Era, leaves behind coarse, buff-colored vessels and rectangular mud brick houses with internal storage rooms. Further south, the Samara culture pushes into the rain-shadow zone between reliable rainfall and true desert. And here, the critical innovation appears: deliberate canal irrigation. At Tel Es-Sawan on the Middle Tigris, irrigation channels divert river water to fields that could not otherwise produce a crop. And still further south, beyond the line where rain alone can sustain agriculture, lies the great alluvial plain, empty and silent beneath the sun. No stone exists here to quarry. No timber grows to fell. The rivers flood unpredictably, sometimes destroying as much as they nourish. Yet the soil itself is extraordinarily fertile, if water can be controlled. The communities now spreading south from the Samaran zone carry with them the knowledge of canal building, of grain storage, of communal labor organized around seasonal need. They build with what the land offers: river mud shaped into bricks and dried in the sun, reeds bundled and bent into arched frameworks, bitumen seeping from natural deposits used to waterproof hulls and seal storage jars. By 6000 before the Common Era, the Halaf culture flourishes across the northern arc, its settlements recognizable by stunning painted pottery, decorated with geometric patterns and animal motifs in red and black on cream-colored clay. These are prosperous farming communities linked by trade networks stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the Iranian plateau. Halaf potters achieve a technical mastery that will not be surpassed for millennia. But the future does not belong to the north. It belongs to the flat, featureless, impossibly challenging south, where the absence of everything nature provides freely elsewhere will force human communities into forms of cooperation, administration, and invention that the world has never seen before. The South receives them. Sometime after 5500 before the Common Era, communities begin to establish themselves in the extreme lower reaches of the Mesopotamian plain, a landscape of reed marsh, seasonal flood, and relentless sun where no settlement has taken permanent root before. The people who arrive here carry with them the painted pottery traditions and farming knowledge of the north, but they face a world that offers almost nothing freely. The soil is rich, impossibly rich, deposited over millennia by the Euphrates in its slow wandering across the flatland. But without rain, nothing grows. Every field must be watered by hand, by canal, by the deliberate redirection of river flow across the land. This single constraint reshapes everything. A lone family cannot dig and maintain a canal. 10 families can. 50 families can feed a town. At the southern edge of this emerging world, on a low, sandy ridge overlooking marshland that stretches toward the Persian Gulf, a small community builds a shrine. The site is called Eridu, Tel Abu Shahrain in the modern landscape, and later Sumerian tradition will remember it as the first city ever to receive kingship from the heavens. Excavations in the 1940s reveal something extraordinary beneath the later ruins. 17 superimposed temple structures, one built directly atop the remains of another, stretching back to the earliest Ubaid settlement. The lowest level, Temple 16, is barely a room. a small mud brick structure with a niche for offerings and the remains of fish bones scattered on the floor, perhaps left for a god whose name is lost. But it is a temple, a space set apart, a permanent house for something greater than the people who built it. Each rebuilding enlarges the structure. Walls thicken, platforms rise. By the middle levels, the temple at Eridu stands on a raised platform of packed earth and mud brick, a form that will evolve over 2,000 years into the ziggurat. The god who dwells here in later tradition is Enki, lord of fresh water and wisdom, and the marshland setting makes sense of that association. Fresh water seeping up through the earth, mingling with the salt marsh, sustaining reeds and fish and date palms. This is the domain of Enki, and Eridu is his city before all others. The Ubaid culture radiates outward from this southern heartland. Its painted pottery, distinctive buff-colored ware decorated with dark geometric designs, appears at sites across the entire Mesopotamian plain, north to south, and beyond. From the Gulf Coast to the foothills, from the Levantine fringe to the Iranian plateau, Ubaid-style material culture spreads not by conquest, but by contact, trade, and cultural prestige. Along the western shore of the Persian Gulf, Ubaid pottery appears at coastal sites in what is now Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, evidence of maritime exchange networks already linking southern Mesopotamia to distant shores. Within the settlements themselves, a new social order is taking shape. Burial evidence shows differentiation. Some graves contain more goods than others. Certain structures grow larger and more centrally located. Small clay tokens, cones, spheres, discs, appear in increasing numbers, used apparently to count and record quantities of goods stored or exchanged. These humble objects are the distant ancestors of writing itself, though more than 2,000 years will pass before the system matures into script. The temples grow, the settlements grow. Eridu, Uruk, names that will dominate the next 3 millennia of history, are already inhabited during the Ubaid period. The irrigated fields push outward from the riverbanks, canals multiply, the population rises, and the flat southern plain, which offered nothing except soil and sun and water, begins to produce something unprecedented. Surplus wealth concentrated in the hands of institutions, temples that command labor, store grain, and organize the redistribution of resources across growing communities. The priests who tend the shrine of Enki at Eridu are not yet kings, but they hold the grain, they count the offerings, they speak for the gods. And in this world where survival depends on collective labor, whoever organizes the labor holds the power. The foundations are laid. The cities are coming. The cities are coming, and the first among them rises where the Euphrates bends through the southern plain, at a site the Sumerians will call Unug, and later ages will know as Uruk. By 3500 before the Common Era, this settlement has already outgrown every community the world has ever produced. Its footprint spreads across the flat landscape like a stain of mud brick and packed earth, swallowing older villages, absorbing their populations, pulling labor and grain and ambition inward toward a center that grows denser with each generation. The scale defies anything that preceded it. Within 5 centuries, Uruk covers 250 hectares behind a defensive wall that stretches nearly 10 kilometers in circuit. Between 40,000 and 80,000 people press into its districts. Potters, weavers, canal diggers, grain processors, builders, priests, administrators, and laborers whose lives are organized not by kinship alone, but by institution. The temple complexes of the Iana district and the Anu precinct dominate the skyline, their platforms rising in stepped tiers above the flat rooftops of residential quarters. Atop the Anu ziggurat, the white temple stands sheathed in gypsum plaster that catches the sun and throws white light across the plain. Its recessed niches and altar platform mark it as a dwelling place of the sky god, raised above the human world on a foundation 13 meters high. The demand this city generates is extraordinary. Tens of thousands of mouths require feeding. The beveled rim bowl, crude, mass-produced, uniform in size, appears in staggering quantities across the site. Archaeologists recover them by the thousands. These simple vessels served as standardized ration containers, each holding a measured portion of grain or bread distributed to laborers. They are evidence not of artistry but of bureaucracy, a system feeding a workforce at institutional scale. And bureaucracy, pressed beyond what memory and spoken agreement can sustain, invents something new. Around 3200 before the Common Era, in the Iana precinct of Uruk, human hands press a reed stylus into wet clay and produce the earliest known written records. These are not literature. They are lists, counts of grain, tallies of livestock, inventories of goods flowing into temple storerooms. The signs are pictographic at first, a simplified drawing of a sheaf of barley, a head of cattle, a jar of oil, accompanied by numerical impressions indicating quantity. The tablets are small, fitting in the palm. They dry in the sun and become permanent. This is the threshold. Writing emerges not from poetry or prayer, but from accounting. The temple institutions of Uruk manage resources across a territory that extends far beyond the city walls, and the complexity of that management exceeds what any human memory can hold. Cylinder seals carved from stone are rolled across clay surfaces to mark ownership, authorize transfers, and identify officials. Each seal produces a unique, continuous impression, a technological solution to the problem of authentication in a world of growing anonymous transactions. From Uruk, this urban model radiates outward. The phenomenon scholars call the Uruk expansion carries the material culture of southern Mesopotamia, its pottery styles, its administrative technologies, its architectural forms, across the Near East. Uruk-style colonies and trading outposts appear along the upper Euphrates at sites like Habuba Kabira in the foothills of southeastern Anatolia and along routes reaching toward the Iranian plateau. Whether by trade, colonization, or cultural emulation, the Uruk world projects its influence across a vast arc of territory. Within the city, the title of En emerges, the first identifiable political office in human history, combining religious authority with temporal power. The En presides over the Iana complex, mediating between the community and Inanna, goddess of the storehouse and of desire. Power has found its seat. The written sign, the measured ration, the sealed tablet, the raised temple, the titled ruler, all converge in this single city on the southern plain. The world before Uruk knew villages and towns. After Uruk, it knows civilization. And the clay tablets stacked in the temple archives, still damp with the pressure of reed on earth, carry the first permanent record of human thought into a future their makers cannot imagine. The cities multiply. By 2900 before the Common Era, the southern plain holds not one great center but dozens, each walled, each sovereign, each claiming divine favor. Uruk remains vast, but it is no longer alone. Ur commands the marshlands near the sea. Lagash controls rich agricultural territory between the Tigris and the eastern canals. Nippur sits at the geographic heart of Sumer, its temple of Enlil conferring a legitimacy no king can manufacture alone. Kish dominates the northern edge of the alluvial plain, where Sumerian territory meets Semitic-speaking populations. Umma presses against Lagash across a disputed boundary canal. And between them all, the flat land offers no natural barriers, no mountains, no forests, no defensible passes. Only irrigation ditches and mud-brick walls separate one city's domain from another. The age of the city-state has arrived, and with it, permanent war. Kingship crystallizes in this period as a distinct institution. The Sumerian king list, compiled centuries later but drawing on earlier traditions, records dynasties passing from city to city, Kish, Uruk, Ur, Awan, Lagash, as though sovereignty were a torch handed between them by the gods. In practice, multiple cities hold power simultaneously, their rulers styling themselves Lugal, Great Man, or Ensi, a title closer to governor, depending on the scope of their ambition. The Lugal commands armies. He adjudicates disputes. He builds walls and dedicates temples. But his authority rests always on two foundations: military victory and the approval of Enlil at Nippur. No city conquers Nippur permanently. It remains the sacred center, the place where earthly rule receives divine sanction. The wars leave records in stone. Around 2450 before the Common Era, Eannatum of Lagash defeats Umma in a bitter conflict over the Gu-Edena, a fertile border territory. He commemorates his victory on the stele of the vultures, limestone carved with marching infantry in tight phalanx formation, shields locked, spears leveled, trampling fallen enemies while vultures carry away the heads of the dead. It is the earliest detailed depiction of organized warfare in human history. The dispute itself stretches across generations, documented in inscriptions from both sides, revealing a world where irrigation water and arable land are worth more than any treasure. Deep beneath the royal cemetery of Ur, sealed in pits dating to roughly 2600 before the Common Era, the dead tell another story. Leonard Woolley's excavations in the 1920s uncovered 16 tombs of extraordinary wealth. Gold vessels and gold ribbon wound through elaborate headdresses. A lyre decorated with a bull's head in gold and lapis lazuli. Cylinder seals of exquisite craftsmanship. Carnelian beads traded from the Indus Valley. And in the largest pits, the bodies, not only of the principal dead, but of dozens of attendants, soldiers, musicians, and oxen drivers, arranged in orderly rows as though they walked willingly into death beside their sovereign. The tomb identified as Queen Puabi's held her body adorned with a headdress of gold leaves, ribbons, and rings of carnelian and lapis lazuli weighing over 6 kilograms. Around her lay the remains of her court. No inscriptions explain the theology that demanded such sacrifice. The evidence simply presents itself. A society in which the boundary between this world and the next required a royal household to cross together. Above ground, the cities grow denser. Temple complexes expand into economic institutions managing land, labor, herds, and trade. The royal standard of Ur, a wooden box inlaid with shell, red limestone, and lapis lazuli, depicts the city at both war and peace. On one face, chariots and infantry crush enemies beneath their advance. On the other, Servants carry goods to a banquet where a ruler drinks among musicians. These twin images define the early dynastic world. Power expressed through conquest. Power celebrated through surplus. The cities of Sumer have invented politics as a competitive, violent, and ritualized contest between equals, and the flat plain between the rivers has become an arena from which no city can withdraw. The question pressing against this fractured world is whether any single ruler might ever unite it. The answer comes from the north, from the Akkadian-speaking lands above the Sumerian heartland, from a world of Semitic language communities that has long existed alongside and within the southern city-states. A single figure emerges whose origins are deliberately obscured in legend. Later tradition preserves a birth narrative, a child set adrift on the river in a basket of rushes, sealed with bitumen, drawn from the water and raised as a gardener, beloved of the goddess Ishtar. The story carries the weight of destiny crafted after the fact. What the historical record confirms is simpler and more striking. A man named Sharukin, the name itself means the legitimate king, suggesting perhaps that he was nothing of the kind, served as cupbearer to Zababa, king of Kish. Sometime around 2334 before the Common Era, he seized power. The bronze head found at Nineveh, now in the Iraq Museum, may depict him or one of his successors. The face is calm, composed, almost meditative, braided hair pulled into a bun, a great curled beard rendered in precise rows of spiral locks, hollow eye sockets that once held precious stones. It is the face of imperial authority given permanent form in cast metal. Whether or not it shows Sargon himself, it captures what the Akkadian dynasty projected. Controlled power, supreme confidence, the human ruler elevated to something approaching the divine. Sargon did not merely conquer one rival city, he broke the entire system. Campaign after campaign carried his armies south through Sumer. Uruk fell, Ur fell, Lagash fell, Umma fell. The Sumerian king list records that he defeated Lugal-Zagizi of Uruk, who had himself briefly unified much of the south, and brought him in a neckstock to the gate of the god Enlil at Nippur. With that act, the age of competing city-states ended. In its place rose something without precedent, a territorial empire ruled from a single capital, the city of Akkad, a city so thoroughly lost that its location remains unknown to this day. The empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the upper reaches of the Euphrates, and royal inscriptions claim campaigns reaching the cedar forests of Lebanon and the silver mines of Anatolia. Sargon installed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at Ur, a political appointment binding the conquered south to the northern dynasty through sacred office. She composed hymns in Sumerian that survive on clay tablets, making her the earliest named author in human history. Akkadian, a Semitic language, became the tongue of administration and royal correspondence across the empire. Sumerian endured as a literary and liturgical language, but power now spoke differently. The imperial bureaucracy appointed governors over former city-states, standardized weights and measures, maintained roads, and collected tribute in grain, livestock, and labor. A standing professional army, depicted on victory steles in standardized equipment, helmets, spears, axes, replaced the seasonal militias of earlier centuries. Under Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, who reigned around 2254 to 2218 before the Common Era, the dynasty reached its ideological apex. Naram-Sin took the unprecedented step of declaring himself a god during his own lifetime, writing his name with the divine determinative and wearing the horned crown of divinity on his famous victory stele. That stele, carved in pink limestone, now in the Louvre, shows him ascending a mountain, trampling enemies beneath his feet, gazing upward toward divine stars. No Mesopotamian king had claimed such status before. Yet within decades of Naram-Sin's death, the empire fractured. The Gutians, hill peoples from the Zagros, raided the lowlands. Provincial governors stopped sending tribute. The administrative networks that held the territory together unraveled. Climate data drawn from deep-sea cores and cave deposits across the Near East point to a severe arid event around 2200 before the Common Era, the 4.2 kiloyear climate event, which may have collapsed the agricultural yields on which the entire imperial economy depended. The last Akkadian king, Shar-Kali-Shari, whose name bitterly echoes his ancestors, king of all kings, died around 2193 before the Common Era. After him, the king list records a haunting phrase: "Who was king? Who was not king?" The world's first empire had lasted barely a century and a half, but the idea it had introduced, that one ruler could command all the land between the rivers and beyond, would never be forgotten. The answer rises from the ruins. In the decades after the Akkadian collapse, the southern cities drift back toward fragmentation. Local governors styling themselves kings, Gutian warlords from the Zagros highlands extracting tribute from weakened settlements, the old irrigation networks silting without centralized maintenance. But the memory of empire persists. The idea that the land between the rivers can be governed as one, that idea survives in the temples of Nippur, in the scribal traditions of Ur and Lagash, in the administrative language that Akkad had spread across the plain, and it is from this memory that a new order emerges. Around 2112 before the Common Era, a man named Ur-Nammu takes the throne of Ur. He is not a conqueror in the Sargonic mold. He is a builder. Within years of consolidating power, he begins the most ambitious construction project the southern plain has seen in generations. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, a massive stepped structure of mud brick rising in 3 stages above the flat horizon, its core packed with reed rope drainage layers to prevent moisture from collapsing its enormous weight. The ziggurat stands as the physical declaration of a restored civilization, Sumerian in language, Sumerian in religious practice, but shaped by everything the Akkadian century had taught about governing territory at scale. Ur-Nammu issues a law code, the earliest surviving legal text in human history, predating Hammurabi by 3 centuries. Its prologue speaks of justice, standardizing weights and measures, protecting the orphan and the widow, ensuring that the powerful cannot exploit the weak. The laws prescribe fines rather than the physical mutilations later codes would favor. It is a document of administrative confidence, a state so certain of its reach that it legislates the price of divorce and the penalty for false accusation. But it is not the ziggurat or the law code that truly distinguishes the 3rd dynasty of Ur. It is paper, or rather clay. The Ur III state generates administrative documentation on a scale unmatched anywhere in the ancient world for another millennium. Over 100,000 cuneiform tablets survive from this period, and scholars estimate that millions more once existed. Every transaction is recorded. Every sheep sheared in a provincial temple flock receives a tablet entry. Every laborer conscripted for canal maintenance is logged by name, ration allotment, and days worked. The gur, a standardized grain measure of approximately 300 liters, becomes the unit of economic calculation across the empire. Provincial governors report to the capital through a system of rotating taxation called the bala, in which each province takes turns funding the central cult at Nippur. The state that Ur-Nammu founds and his son Shulgi perfects over a reign of nearly 48 years is not merely an empire. It is a bureaucracy so total that modern Assyriologists can reconstruct the daily caloric intake of temple weavers, the breeding cycles of state-owned cattle herds, and the travel schedules of royal messengers crossing between and the northern provinces. Shulgi reforms the scribal curriculum, standardizes the calendar, and commissions hymns praising his own divinity. For he declares himself a god in his lifetime, the first Mesopotamian ruler since Naram-Sin to claim that status. The empire stretches from the Persian Gulf to the edges of Assyria. Its roads are maintained, its granaries are full, yet the system contains its own fragility. By 2040 before the Common Era, Amorite-speaking pastoralists press against the empire's western and northern frontiers in numbers that the bureaucratic machinery cannot absorb. A defensive wall called the Murik Tidnim, the repeller of the Tidnum, is built across the northern plain. It fails. Simultaneously, the Elamites on the eastern frontier grow bolder. In 2004, before the Common Era, an Elamite army sacks itself, carries away its last king, Ibi-Sin, in chains to the highland city of Anshan. The event produces one of Mesopotamia's most haunting literary compositions, The Lament for the Destruction of a poem describing empty streets, corpses unburied, the great temples profaned. The last Sumerian empire is over. Sumerian itself will survive only as a learned language, the Latin of Mesopotamia, preserved in scribal schools for another 1,500 years. The world it built endures in tablets, stacked by the tens of thousands in archive rooms beneath the dust. The Amorites inherit the wreckage. Across the 20th and 19th centuries before the Common Era, these semi-nomadic West Semitic peoples, whom Ur's kings had tried so desperately to wall out, settle into the vacant thrones of southern Mesopotamia. They do not destroy the cities. They occupy them, adopt their gods, learn their scribal traditions, and establish new dynasties in Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, and a dozen smaller centers. The old urban fabric survives, the canals still flow, the temples still receive offerings. But political unity has shattered into competing kingdoms, each ruled by an Amorite house claiming ancient legitimacy it does not possess. Among these cities sits Babylon, Babilim, the Gate of the Gods, a modest settlement on the Euphrates, barely mentioned in earlier records. Its first Amorite dynasty, founded around 1894 before the Common Era by Sumu Abum, governs a territory of perhaps 50 kilometers in any direction. For 5 generations, Babylon's kings remain minor players, hemmed between larger powers, Larsa to the south, Eshnunna to the east, the kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia to the north, and the great trading city of Mari on the middle Euphrates. Everything changes with the 6th king of this line. Hammurabi ascends the throne in 1792 before the Common Era, inheriting a small but well-administered state. For the first 3 decades of his reign, he builds canals, fortifies walls, and waits. The Mari archives, thousands of clay tablet letters excavated from the palace of King Zimri Lim, reveal the diplomatic world in which he operates, a network of roughly equal kings exchanging messengers, forming alliances, breaking them, hiring mercenaries, and spying on one another with elaborate intelligence systems. One letter observes that no king is strong enough to act alone, that 10 or 15 kings follow Hammurabi, and as many follow each of his rivals. Then, in his 30th regnal year, Hammurabi strikes. Between 1764 and 1755 before the Common Era, he conquers Larsa, defeats Eshnunna, destroys Mari, his former ally, and absorbs the northern territories. In less than a decade, Babylon controls all of southern and central Mesopotamia. Hammurabi styles himself king of the 4 quarters of the world. His most enduring act is not conquest, but codification. The black diorite stele now in the Louvre, over 2 meters tall, carved with 282 laws, beneath a relief showing Hammurabi receiving authority from the sun god Shamash, represents the most complete legal document surviving from the ancient world. Its provisions cover property, trade, family, labor, assault, and professional liability. A builder whose house collapses and kills the owner is put to death. A surgeon whose bronze lancet kills a patient loses his hand. The laws are not egalitarian, penalties differ by social class, but they establish the principle that royal justice is publicly declared, universally accessible, and divinely sanctioned. Babylon becomes simultaneously a political and theological capital. The god Marduk, once a minor deity, rises with his city. Temples are rebuilt. The scribal schools flourish, copying Sumerian literature, composing new works in Akkadian, training the administrators who manage an empire through clay correspondence. Hammurabi dies around 1750 before the Common Era. His successors hold the empire for a century and a half, but it contracts steadily. The south breaks away, the frontiers recede, Kassite raiders press from the Zagros highlands. In 1595, before the Common Era, a Hittite army under Mursili I marches down the Euphrates from distant Anatolia, sacks Babylon, and withdraws as suddenly as it came, carrying away the statue of Marduk. Into the vacuum slip the Kassites, who will rule Babylon quietly for the next 4 centuries. The old Babylonian world ends, but the city endures, and the idea it planted, that a single capital, a single god, and a single written law can order an entire civilization, will outlast every dynasty that governs from its gates. The knowledge lives in clay. Across every century of Mesopotamian civilization, from the earliest Sumerian city-states through the final decades of Babylonian astronomy, the intellectual life of the land between the rivers is pressed into wet tablets and dried in the sun. And what those tablets contain represents the most sustained tradition of learning the ancient world produced. The institution at its center is the Edubba, the tablet house. In courtyards attached to temples and palaces, in private homes of master scribes, young students sit cross-legged on reed mats and learn to press a cut stylus into damp clay. The curriculum is rigorous and hierarchical. Students begin with simple wedge exercises, copying sign lists over and over until muscle memory takes hold. They advance to Sumerian vocabulary lists, then mathematical tables, multiplication, reciprocals, square roots. Only after years of this foundational work do they reach the literary texts, hymns, proverbs, royal inscriptions, and eventually the great compositions that form the canon of Mesopotamian literature. A student who completes the full course becomes Not merely literate, but a specialist in the most powerful technology the ancient world possesses, the ability to fix language permanently outside the human mind. The greatest literary achievement to emerge from this scribal tradition is the Epic of Gilgamesh. The earliest Sumerian poems about the legendary king of Uruk date to around 2100 before the Common Era. Over centuries, Babylonian scribes gather, reshape, and unify these into a coherent 12-tablet masterwork. The standard Babylonian version, compiled by the scholar-priest Sin-Leki-Uninni around 1200 before the Common Era. The epic explores mortality, friendship, and the limits of human ambition with a sophistication that will not be matched in Western literature for another 1,000 years. But Gilgamesh is not alone. The scribal libraries preserve creation myths, the Enuma Elish, recited annually at Babylon's New Year festival, in which the god Marduk slays the primordial ocean Tiamat and shapes the world from her body. They preserve the Atrahasis epic, with its account of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, a narrative whose parallels to later biblical tradition are unmistakable. Behind the literature stands religion. The temple is the economic and spiritual center of every Mesopotamian city. Each major deity maintains a household, the god statue dressed, fed, and attended daily by priests and priestesses as though it were a living king. Enlil of Nippur commands the divine assembly. Enki of Eridu governs wisdom and fresh water. Inanna of Uruk, later called Ishtar, presides over love, war, and the boundary between order and chaos. The En-priestess, a woman of royal blood installed as the deity's earthly spouse, holds extraordinary authority. The most famous is Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, high priestess of the moon god Nanna at around 2300 before the Common Era, the world's first author whose name survives attached to her own compositions. The temple economy generates the need for mathematics and astronomy alike. Land must be surveyed, harvests predicted, ritual calendars maintained. Babylonian mathematicians work in base 60, a system that persists today in the 60-minute hour and the 360-degree circle. By the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, Babylonian astronomers in cities like Babylon and Uruk are systematically recording planetary positions, compiling the astronomical diaries that track celestial events night after night across generations. By the late 7th century, they can predict lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy, not through theory in the Greek sense, but through pattern recognition applied to centuries of accumulated observational data. This intellectual tradition does not die with the fall of Assyria or Babylon. It passes outward, into Persian administrative practice, into Greek philosophical inquiry, into the mathematical and astronomical heritage of the Islamic Golden Age. The zodiac, the division of the circle, the prediction of celestial events, the very concept of systematic written scholarship, all trace their deepest roots to the scribes who sat in temple courtyards beside the Euphrates, pressing reed into clay, building a monument of knowledge that would outlast every ziggurat ever raised above the plain. Far to the north of the Sumerian heartland, where the Tigris carves through limestone bluffs before descending into the broad alluvial plain, a different kind of Mesopotamian power takes shape, not from temple estates and canal networks, but from trade. The city of Assa sits on a rocky promontory above the western bank of the Tigris, commanding a crossing point where routes from Anatolia, Iran, and the southern cities converge. Unlike Ur or Babylon, Assur possesses no great agricultural hinterland. Its wealth comes from movement, from the caravans of donkeys that depart its gates loaded with tin from the east and fine textiles from the south, bound for the copper-rich highlands of central Anatolia over 1,000 kilometers distant. By the 19th century before the Common Era, Assyrian merchants have established a network of commercial colonies across Anatolia, the most important centered at Karum-Kanesh, near the modern Turkish city of Kayseri. The archive recovered there, more than 23,000 clay tablets, reveals a world of astonishing commercial sophistication. Merchants write home to their families in Assur, with instructions on credit arrangements, interest rates, shipping insurance, and the resolution of contract disputes. Wives manage the textile workshops whose products fund the trade. Tin purchased from intermediaries connected to sources in Afghanistan travels westward on donkey caravans, each animal carrying roughly 60 kilograms, crossing mountain passes and hostile territory to reach Anatolian markets hungry for bronze-making materials. Profit margins reach 100% on good shipments. The entire system operates through private enterprise, family partnerships, and enforceable written contracts, not royal command. This merchant identity marks Assyria's earliest character. The city's god, also named Ashur, presides over a community governed not by absolute kings, but by a council of elders and an annually appointed official called the Limu, whose name marks the year. Power is collective, commercial, cautious. Yet the world shifts. By the 14th century before the Common Era, Assyria transforms under Ashurbanipal I into a territorial kingdom capable of treating with Egypt and Babylon as an equal. His successors, Adad-nirari I, Shalmaneser I, Tukulti-Ninurta I, build the Middle Assyrian state into an aggressive military power. Tukulti-Ninurta conquers Babylon itself around 1225 before the Common Era, carrying the statue of Marduk back to Assur in triumph. Royal inscriptions grow bombastic, detailing campaigns of slaughter and submission. The king is no longer first among merchants. He is the chosen weapon of the god Ashur, ordained to extend divine dominion over all lands. Then catastrophe. Around 1200 before the Common Era, the interconnected Bronze Age world collapses. The Hittite Empire disintegrates, trade networks shatter, Aramean tribal groups flood westward across the Euphrates in waves that Assyrian kings struggle to contain. The empire contracts. For nearly 2 centuries, Assyria fights for survival rather than expansion, its territory reduced, its records sparse, its kings consumed by defensive warfare against mobile enemies who cannot be pinned to a single battlefield. The recovery, when it comes, is slow and deliberate. Ashurdan II, reigning in the mid-10th century before the Common Era, stabilizes the heartland. His son Adad-nirari II begins systematic reconquest of lost provinces. The instrument of revival is military professionalization, iron weapons replacing bronze, cavalry supplementing chariots, campaigns conducted annually as a matter of royal policy rather than reactive defense. By 900 before the Common Era, Assyria stands poised at the threshold of empire once more. The lessons of collapse have been absorbed. The new Assyrian state will not rely on trade alone, nor on fragile Bronze Age alliances. It will project power through direct military domination, provincial administration, and the deliberate cultivation of terror as policy. The merchant city on the Tigris has become something else entirely. A war machine awakening, preparing to reshape the entire ancient Near East in its image. The war machine awakens in the reign of Ashurnasirpal II, who ascends the throne of Assyria in 883 before the Common Era and immediately announces his intentions through fire and iron. His royal inscriptions, carved into stone slabs lining the walls of his palace, describe campaigns of systematic brutality, cities burned, populations flayed, pyramids of severed heads stacked at city gates. These are not the boasts of a madman. They are calculated policy. Terror deployed with precision becomes the empire's most efficient weapon. Cities that resist are annihilated. Cities that submit pay tribute and survive. The message travels faster than any army. Within a decade, Ashurnasirpal's campaigns sweep from the Zagros mountain passes in the east to the shores of the Mediterranean in the west. Assyrian infantry march in disciplined formations, iron-tipped spears, laminated bows, bronze-scaled armor. Chariot squadrons thunder across open plains. Siege engineers construct ramps, battering rams, and undermining tunnels with a professionalism no contemporary state can match. The annual campaign becomes institutional. Each spring the army mobilizes, each autumn it returns laden with tribute. Cedar logs from Lebanon, copper from the Taurus foothills, gold and silver from the Aramaean principalities of Syria. But Ashurnasirpal's ambition is not merely military. In 879 before the Common Era, he abandons the ancient capital of Assur and inaugurates a new city, Kalhu, known to later ages as Nimrud. The northwest palace rises on the banks of the upper Tigris, its halls lined with carved alabaster panels depicting royal lion hunts, siege warfare, and divine protection. At each gateway stand colossal lamassu, winged bulls with human heads, carved from single blocks of limestone, weighing tens of tons, their serene faces gazing outward as eternal guardians. The inauguration banquet, recorded in a surviving inscription, hosts 69,574 guests from across the empire, fed for 10 days on cattle, sheep, fowl, fish, beer, and wine. It is a declaration. Assyria has arrived as the dominant power of the ancient world. Ashurnasirpal's son Shalmaneser III inherits the machine in 858 before the Common Era and drives it further. His reign of 35 years produces near-constant warfare along the empire's western frontier, where a coalition of Levantine states repeatedly attempts to block Assyrian expansion. At Karkar on the Orontes River in 853 before the Common Era, Shalmaneser meets an alliance led by Hadadezer of Damascus and Ahab of Israel, the first documented contact between Assyria and the Kingdom of Israel. The battle recorded on Shalmaneser's monolith inscription is indecisive, but the Assyrian pressure never relents. Campaign after campaign grinds down the Western coalitions. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser, a carved basalt monument discovered at Nimrud, depicts 5 rows of tribute-bearers from subjugated lands prostrating themselves before the Assyrian king. One panel shows Jehu of Israel, or his ambassador, bowing to the ground, offering gold, silver, and precious vessels. It is the earliest surviving depiction of an Israelite figure in ancient art. Yet even the war machine strains. Shalmaneser's final years bring civil war. His own son Ashur-danin-pal rebels, and the empire fractures briefly into internal conflict. The period from roughly 820 to 745 before the Common Era sees weaker kings, provincial governors accumulating autonomous power, and external pressure from Urartu to the north. The institutional machinery endures, but the driving force wavers. Assyria does not collapse. It pauses, consolidates, and waits. The next transformation, the administrative revolution that will turn this regional power into a true world empire, lies just ahead, gathering in the ambition of a man who will take the throne name, Tiglath-Pileser. The man who seizes the Assyrian throne in 745 before the Common Era is not born to it. Tiglath-Pileser III rises through what the sources suggest is a palace coup, overthrowing the weak king Ashur-Nirari V, and from his first regnal year he reshapes the empire with a ruthlessness that is not merely military, but administrative. The old system of vassal kingdoms paying tribute while retaining their own rulers. The system that allowed governors to accumulate dangerous autonomy is dismantled province by province. In its place, Tiglath-Pileser imposes direct Assyrian rule, appointed governors answering to the palace, standardized tax collection, and a policy of mass deportation so systematic that it becomes the defining instrument of imperial control. The deportations are staggering in scale. Entire populations, tens of thousands at a time, are uprooted from conquered territories and resettled in distant provinces. The intent is calculated: sever the bonds between people and homeland, break local identity, prevent future rebellion, and simultaneously populate underdeveloped regions with skilled labor. Royal inscriptions record the numbers with bureaucratic precision. Tiglath-Pileser claims to have deported over 150,000 people from Babylonian and Western territories during his reign alone. The Western campaigns bring Syria, Phoenicia, and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah firmly under Assyrian domination. In 732 before the Common Era, Damascus falls. The kingdom of Israel is reduced to a rump state around Samaria. The Assyrian war machine, now professionalized with a standing army including specialized corps of cavalry, charioteers, archers, and siege engineers, operates with a logistical sophistication unmatched in the ancient world. Sargon II, who takes the throne in 722, completes the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, deporting its population into Assyrian territory and resettling the region with foreign peoples. He builds an entirely new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, modern Khorsabad, a planned city of extraordinary ambition. Its walls enclose nearly 300 hectares. The palace complex rises on a raised platform at the city's edge, its gates flanked by colossal winged bulls carved from single blocks of stone, each weighing perhaps 40 tons. Yet Sargon dies on campaign in 705, and his son Sennacherib abandons Dur-Sharrukin entirely. He chooses Nineveh, ancient, centrally located, fed by canal systems he expands dramatically, as his capital. The palace without rival, as Sennacherib names it, stretches across the citadel mound with over 70 rooms lined with carved stone panels. Its reliefs depict the siege of Lachish in 701 before the Common Era in extraordinary detail. Siege ramps built of packed earth, battering rams under wicker shelters, defenders hurling torches, columns of deportees filing away from the burning city. That same campaign brings Sennacherib to the walls of Jerusalem, where King Hezekiah holds out. The Assyrian annals claim massive tribute extracted. The city itself survives. Sennacherib's rage turns toward Babylon. After years of rebellion supported by Elamite interference, he destroys the sacred city in 689 before the Common Era, an act so shocking to the Mesopotamian world that even later Assyrian sources treat it with unease. His own assassination by his sons in 681 may be connected to this sacrilege. Esarhaddon, the son who emerges from the succession crisis, rebuilds Babylon as deliberate policy and then achieves what no Mesopotamian king had accomplished: the conquest of Egypt. In 671 before the Common Era, Assyrian forces cross the Sinai, defeat the Kushite pharaoh Taharka, and take Memphis. The empire now stretches from the Nile Delta to the marshes of the Persian Gulf, the largest territorial state the world has yet known. Esarhaddon binds his vassals through elaborate loyalty treaties, fragments of which survive from the ceremonial imposition on Median chieftains. Every clause demands absolute submission to the designated succession. The machinery of empire operates at a scale that strains comprehension, administered through clay tablets, provincial governors, relay stations, and the ever-present threat of the army's return. The succession holds. In 668 before the Common Era, Ashurbanipal ascends the throne of Assyria as his father Esarhaddon had meticulously arranged, the loyalty oaths binding every vassal to accept this moment without question. He inherits the largest empire on earth, but he also inherits its fractures. His brother Shamash-shum-ukin receives the subordinate kingship of Babylon, a deliberate arrangement meant to satisfy Babylonian pride while preserving Assyrian supremacy. For 16 years this dual arrangement holds. Then it shatters. Ashurbanipal's first campaigns look south and west. Egypt, conquered by his father, slips away within a decade. The Kushite pharaoh Tanutamani retakes Memphis, and though Ashurbanipal's forces march the length of the Nile to sack Thebes itself in 663 before the Common Era, an event so devastating it echoes in the Hebrew prophet Nahum, Egypt is ultimately lost. The Scythe dynasty under Psamtik I consolidates an independent Egypt that Assyria never reclaims. The empire's western frontier contracts, but the true crisis erupts from within. In 652 before the Common Era, Shamash-shum-ukin raises Babylon in open revolt against his brother. He draws Elamites, Chaldeans, Arabs, and discontented Assyrian vassals into a grand coalition. The war lasts 4 years. Ashurbanipal besieges Babylon itself, starving the city into submission. When it falls in 648, Shamash-shum-ukin perishes. Tradition holds he immolates himself in his burning palace. Ashurbanipal then turns his fury eastward against Elam, sacking Susa in 647 and dismantling the Elamite state so thoroughly that it ceases to function as an independent power. In the aftermath of these victories, Ashurbanipal commissions the reliefs that will become the supreme achievement of Assyrian art. In the North Palace at Nineveh, carved alabaster panels depict the royal lion hunt in extraordinary detail. Wounded lionesses dragging paralyzed hindquarters, arrows piercing muscled flanks, the king calm and ritually composed as he dispatches beasts released from cages into a controlled arena. These are not hunting scenes. They are theological statements, the king imposing cosmic order upon chaos, fulfilling his divine mandate to master the wild. Yet the most remarkable legacy of this reign is not carved in stone, but pressed into clay. Ashurbanipal assembles within Nineveh a library of over 30,000 tablets, a systematic, deliberate collection of Mesopotamian knowledge. Scribes copy texts from temple archives across Babylonia and Assyria, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation epic, omen series running to dozens of tablets each, medical texts, mathematical tables, ritual instructions, lexical lists, and diplomatic correspondence. The king himself claims literacy in his own inscriptions, an extraordinary boast for an Assyrian monarch, who typically emphasized martial prowess above scholarly achievement. The tablets are organized by subject, stored in labeled baskets and shelved in dedicated rooms. This is not mere accumulation. It is the first known attempt to gather the totality of a civilization's written knowledge in a single place. The banquet relief shows Ashurbanipal reclining in a garden with his queen, drinking wine beneath grape arbors, while the severed head of the Elamite king Teumman hangs from a nearby tree. Victory and leisure merge in a single image of absolute power. But after 631 before the Common Era, the record grows silent. The final years of Ashurbanipal's reign are poorly documented. Civil conflict appears to engulf the succession. Multiple claimants contest the throne. The provinces, exhausted by decades of continuous warfare, begin to loosen from central control. The Medes consolidate power in the Zagros highlands. The Chaldean Nabopolassar seizes Babylon in 626. Within 14 years of Ashurbanipal's death, the coalition armies of Babylon and Media stand before the walls of Nineveh itself. The library waits in its palace rooms, the clay tablets stacked in their ordered rows, recording everything the empire knew, and nothing of what is about to come. The siege begins in the summer of 612 before the Common Era. A coalition army, Babylonians under Nabopolassar, Medes under Cyaxares, and possibly Scythian auxiliaries, encamps along the eastern bank of the Tigris, facing the greatest city in the known world. Nineveh's walls stretch for 12 kilometers, fortified with 15 gates and fronted by a moat system fed by the river itself. The city holds perhaps 150,000 inhabitants. Its palace complexes contain the accumulated wealth and knowledge of 3 centuries of Assyrian imperial dominance. The defenders, under the command of Sin-shar-ishkun, the last king to rule from Nineveh, man the parapets of walls that have never been breached by an enemy. The attackers redirect water. Ancient sources and archaeological evidence converge on the same mechanism. Seasonal flooding or deliberate diversion of waterways undermines a section of the northern wall. The breach opens, the coalition forces pour through. The destruction that follows is total. Palaces burn, temples collapse, the population scatters or perishes. Sin-shar-ishkun dies. Tradition holds that he immolates himself within his burning palace rather than face capture. The fall is so complete that within 2 generations the location of the city begins to fade from living memory. The prophet Nahum's oracle against Nineveh, composed in the years surrounding the event, captures the sentiment of vassal peoples across the Near East. The lion's den is empty, and no one mourns. A remnant Assyrian force under Ashurbanipal II retreats westward to Haran, the old trading city near the upper Euphrates. For 3 years this rump state persists, propped briefly by Egyptian military support. Pharaoh Necho II marching north to preserve the balance of power. But in 610, Haran falls to the combined Babylonian and Median forces. The Assyrian state, which had dominated the Near East for 300 years and projected power from the Nile Delta to the Iranian plateau, ceases to exist. no successor dynasty emerges. No exile government endures. The destruction is without parallel in the ancient world until this point. Into the vacuum steps Babylon. Nabopolassar, a Chaldean governor who had seized the southern city in 626, now commands an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the upper Euphrates. His son, Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar, leads the decisive campaign at Carchemish in 605, annihilating the last Egyptian expeditionary force and securing Babylonian control over Syria and the Levant. When Nabopolassar dies later that same year, Nebuchadnezzar races back to Babylon to claim the throne. The transition is seamless. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, sometimes called the Chaldean Empire, enters its period of maximum power. Nebuchadnezzar II reigns for 43 years, from 604 to 562 before the Common Era. Under his hand, Babylon transforms into the most magnificent city of the ancient world. The inner city covers roughly 900 hectares. The Euphrates bisects it. Massive double walls, the outer circuit running perhaps 18 kilometers, encircle the urban core. The Ishtar Gate, faced in glazed blue brick and adorned with golden relief figures of bulls and dragons sacred to Marduk and Adad, marks the northern entrance to the processional avenue. This road, lined with 60 lions in molded brick representing Ishtar, leads south toward the Esagila temple complex and the great Ziggurat Etemenanki, the foundation of heaven and earth, rising in 7 stages above the flat plain. The king campaigns relentlessly. Jerusalem falls in 597 and again in 586, its temple destroyed, its elite deported to Babylon in the event remembered as the Babylonian exile. Tyre endures a 13-year siege. The Levantine coast submits. But Nebuchadnezzar's legacy rests equally on construction. Canals, fortifications, temples rebuilt across every major Babylonian city, and the capital itself remade as a statement of cosmic order. After Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562, the dynasty fractures. His son Amel-Marduk reigns barely 2 years before assassination. Neriglissar rules 4 years. The child king Labashi-Marduk is murdered within months. In 556, the throne passes to Nabonidus, an outsider, a devotee of the moon god Sin, and with him, the final crisis of Babylonian independence begins. Nabonidus is not interested in Babylon. This is the paradox that defines the final decade of Mesopotamian independence, a king upon the throne of the greatest city on earth who turns his gaze elsewhere, toward the desert oasis of Tamar in northern Arabia, where he will spend 10 years in voluntary exile while his capital drifts toward its end. But before that story reaches its conclusion, the city itself demands attention. For Babylon in the 6th century before the Common Era is not merely a political capital. It is a constructed argument in brick and glaze and geometry, a statement that the order of heaven is reflected in the order of the city below. The Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar II rebuilt over his 43-year reign stands as the largest city in the world. Its outer walls enclose an area of nearly 900 hectares. The inner wall, Imgur-Enlil, runs more than 8 kilometers in circumference, thick enough, according to later Greek accounts, for a 4-horse chariot to turn upon its summit. Towers project at regular intervals. A moat fed by the Euphrates surrounds the entire perimeter. The river itself bisects the city, east bank and west bank, linked by a stone and timber bridge. The processional way runs north to south, through the heart of the eastern city. Its walls rise 12 meters high on either side, faced in glazed brick, deep lapis blue, with striding lions molded in yellow and white relief, 60 of them on each side, sacred to Ishtar. The street itself is paved in limestone and red breccia, each slab inscribed on its underside with Nebuchadnezzar's dedication. At the northern terminus stands the Ishtar Gate, a double-arched portal faced entirely in glazed blue brick, decorated with rows of bulls sacred to Akkad and Mushhush-shu dragons sacred to Marduk, rendered in molded relief with such precision that their muscles seem to shift in the changing light. Beyond the gate, the processional way leads to the Esagila, the temple of Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon, and beside it rises the Etemenanki, the great ziggurat, the structure later remembered as the Tower of Babel. 7 stages climb towards the sky, the base measuring approximately 90 meters on each side. At its summit, a temple finished in blue glazed brick catches the first light of morning. The New Year festival, the Akitu, brings Marduk's statue in solemn procession along this route each spring, reaffirming the cosmic order for another year. The palaces cluster at the city's northern edge. The southern palace alone contains 5 great courtyards, surrounded by throne rooms and administrative halls. The throne room facade gleams with glazed brick panels of palmettes, floral borders, and striding lions. Somewhere in this complex, the ancient sources remain frustratingly unclear, stood what later writers called the Hanging Gardens, terraced plantings raised on vaulted stone substructures and irrigated by mechanical water-lifting devices. Whether these gardens existed in Babylon or were confused with Sennacherib's earlier gardens at Nineveh remains a matter of scholarly debate, but the tradition itself testifies to the city's reputation for impossible splendor. Beneath this monumental surface, Babylon functions as an administrative and economic engine. Thousands of cuneiform tablets from this period document land leases, canal maintenance contracts, temple revenues, slave sales, brewing licenses, and astronomical observations recorded with increasing mathematical precision. The Ejibi family archive alone spans 5 generations of banking and commercial activity. Temples operate as landlords, employers, and creditors simultaneously. Yet Nabonidus neglects the Akitu festival during his Arabian absence. His son Belshazzar governs in Babylon as regent, but the priestly establishment grows hostile. The verse account of Nabonidus, a later propagandist text likely composed under Persian patronage, accuses him of impiety, madness, and abandonment. When Cyrus of Persia advances in 539, Babylon's own priesthood may already view the coming conqueror as preferable to their absent king. The city that Nebuchadnezzar razed to perfection will open its gates without a siege. The walls hold, the gates hold, the will to resist does not. The Persian army enters Babylon in October of 539 before the Common Era. There is no siege, there is no breach in the massive double walls that Nebuchadnezzar raised along the Euphrates. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay barrel inscription discovered in 1879 and now held in the British Museum, records that the god Marduk himself selected Cyrus as righteous ruler, that the Persian king entered the city peacefully, that the people of Babylon greeted him with joy. This is propaganda, composed in Akkadian cuneiform by Babylonian scribes under new patronage. But the archaeological record confirms the essential fact. The city did not burn. The temples were not looted. The transition was administrative, not catastrophic. Cyrus adopts the ancient Babylonian royal titulary. He is king of Babylon, king of the lands, king of the four quarters. He restores cult statues that Nabonidus had controversially gathered into the capital. He permits deported peoples, including the Judean exiles, to return to their homelands. The Achaemenid administration absorbs Mesopotamia as a satrapy, governed first from Babylon itself, which remains one of the empire's primary residences. Darius I spends significant portions of each year in the city. The great temples continue to function. The priesthood of Marduk maintains its rituals. Cuneiform scribes still press their reed style into wet clay. Yet the texture of Mesopotamian life shifts beneath the surface of continuity. Aramaic, written in ink on perishable materials, increasingly replaces cuneiform for administrative and commercial purposes. The clay tablet, the medium that had carried Mesopotamian thought for 3,000 years, begins its long retreat into specialized domains: astronomy, temple ritual, legal archaism. The Ogibi banking house continues operating into the reign of Xerxes, but its later records show an economy increasingly oriented toward Persian imperial needs rather than local Babylonian networks. Xerxes suppresses a Babylonian revolt around 484 before the Common Era. The consequences are severe. He reportedly dismantles the golden statue of Marduk from the Esagila temple, an act that symbolically severs the connection between Persian kingship and Babylonian divine legitimacy. He drops the title King of Babylon. The city remains wealthy, enormous, and commercially vital, but its political autonomy is finished. The astronomical diaries continue. Babylonian scholars in the temples of Uruk and Babylon produce increasingly sophisticated mathematical models of planetary motion. These texts, written in cuneiform on clay tablets dated by Seleucid-era regnal years, represent the final intellectual flowering of a tradition stretching back to the old Babylonian period. The last datable cuneiform astronomical text comes from 75 before the Common Era, a record from Babylon itself. The script that began as grain counts pressed into clay tokens around 3200 before the Common Era finally falls silent after more than 3 millennia of continuous use. When Alexander of Macedon enters Babylon in 331 before the Common Era, he finds a living city, still vast, still commercially powerful, its temples still staffed, its astronomical tradition still active. He plans to make it his eastern capital. He dies there in 323 in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar before the plan materializes. The Seleucid successors found a new capital at Seleucia on the Tigris, drawing population away from Babylon itself. The old city slowly empties across the following centuries. The canals silt without imperial maintenance. The mud brick crumbles in seasonal rains. By the Parthian period, Babylon is a ruin visited by curious travelers who marvel at its scale without comprehending its age. The world between the rivers has not been destroyed. It has been absorbed, diluted, and finally forgotten. Buried beneath tells that will wait 2,000 years for excavation. The tells rise from the plain like burial mounds of memory itself. Beneath them lie the compressed remains of cities that once held tens of thousands: Uruk, Nippur, Ur, Babylon, now silent beneath layers of wind-deposited silt and collapsed mud brick. But in the centuries following Alexander's death in 323 before the Common Era, these cities are not yet dead. They are dying slowly, unevenly, and the process takes nearly 1,000 years. The Seleucid dynasty inherits Mesopotamia as one province among many in an empire stretching from Anatolia to the borders of India. Seleucus I founds his new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, around 305 before the Common Era, positioning it at the junction of canal routes approximately 60 kilometers north of Babylon. The city grows rapidly, perhaps 300,000 inhabitants at its peak, drawing merchants, administrators, and laborers away from the older centers to the south. Greek becomes the language of court and commerce. Temples to Zeus and Apollo rise alongside older sanctuaries. Yet the Seleucid kings do not suppress Mesopotamian tradition. They patronize the ancient temples. Babylonian priests continue their astronomical observations, recording planetary positions on cuneiform tablets with a precision that Greek astronomers openly admire. The astronomical diaries, continuous nightly observations of the sky, persist without interruption from the 8th century before the Common Era deep into the Seleucid period. The last datable cuneiform astronomical text comes from around 75 before the Common Era, a quiet milestone marking the end of over 3,000 years of continuous written tradition in the wedge script. The transition is gradual. Aramaic, already the spoken vernacular across much of Mesopotamia since the Neo-Assyrian period, displaces Akkadian entirely in daily life. Cuneiform retreats into the temples, a priestly script maintained by an ever-shrinking circle of initiates who copy old texts and train fewer students with each generation. The great libraries are not burned, they simply cease to be replenished. In 141 before the Common Era, the Parthian king Mithridates I conquers Seleucia and claims Mesopotamia for the Arsacid dynasty. The Parthians rule from Ctesiphon, built directly across the Tigris from Seleucia, and they govern through a feudal system of vassal kings and semi-autonomous cities. Babylon itself still functions as a settlement in the early Parthian period, a small community clustered around the ancient Esagila temple complex, but the great processional way is buried under rubble. The Ishtar Gate stands half-collapsed above accumulated debris. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, the last individuals who can read cuneiform are gone. The script that recorded the world's first literature, first law codes, first astronomical observations, and first mathematical theorems passes from living knowledge into incomprehensible marks on clay. The tablets themselves endure. Fired clay is nearly indestructible, but their meaning is locked away, awaiting rediscovery. The Sassanid Persians overthrow the Parthians in 224 of the Common Era and rule Mesopotamia as a heartland province. Ctesiphon becomes their winter capital, its great arch, the Tak Khazra, spanning the largest unreinforced brick vault in the world. The land between the rivers remains agriculturally productive where canals are maintained, but the ancient southern cities are archaeological curiosities even to their Sassanid-era inhabitants. Nippur, once the religious capital of all Sumer, is abandoned. Uruk, where writing itself began, holds only a scattered population among ruins they cannot read. In 637 of the Common Era, Arab armies defeat the Sassanid forces at the Battle of Qadisiyah and sweep across Mesopotamia. The new Islamic civilization builds its own cities, Basra, Kufa, and eventually Baghdad, founded in 762 on or near ancient sites, drawing on the same rivers and the same irrigation logic that sustained Sumerian farmers 5,000 years earlier. The mud brick tells settle further into the landscape. Shepherds graze flocks over buried palaces. The rivers shift their courses over abandoned canals. Mesopotamia as a living, self-aware civilization, a world that knew its own name, honored its own gods, and wrote its own history, has finally fallen silent. The clay tablets wait in the dark earth, carrying their witness forward toward a distant age of excavation and decipherment that no scribe in Uruk or Babylon could ever have imagined. In 1811, Claudius James Rich, the British resident in Baghdad, rides out to a series of low mounds rising from the plain south of the modern city. Local farmers have long known that beneath these hills lie walls of ancient brick. Rich sketches the mounds, measures their extent, and publishes a memoir that reaches European scholarly circles with a single electrifying implication. The biblical city of Babylon is real, and it lies here, waiting beneath the Iraqi soil. Within decades, excavation begins in earnest. Austin Henry Layard digs into the mound of Nimrud in 1845 and uncovers the carved stone reliefs of Ashurnasirpal's palace. Winged Lamassu guardians, lion hunts, siege scenes, shipping them downriver on rafts to Basra and onward to the British Museum. Paul-Émile Botta, the French consul at Mosul, has already struck the walls of Sargon's palace at Khorsabad. The ancient Assyrian world, silent for over 2,000 years, suddenly speaks again through its own carved images. The tablets prove harder to read. Cuneiform script, pressed into clay in a language no living person speaks, resists interpretation for decades. The breakthrough comes in stages. Henry Rawlinson's work on the Behistun inscription in the 1840s, Edward Hinks's phonetic insights, and the competitive decipherment trials of 1857, when 4 scholars independently translate the same Assyrian text and produce substantially identical results. The script is cracked, and what pours forth from the tens of thousands of recovered tablets reshapes the understanding of human history. In 1872, George Smith, a self-taught engraver working in the British Museum's tablet room, pieces together a Babylonian flood narrative from Ashurbanipal's library, a story older than Genesis, older than any text in the Hebrew Bible. The announcement causes a sensation across Europe. Through the 20th century, excavation and scholarship deepen. Leonard Woolley's excavation of Ur in the 1920s reveals the royal tombs, their gold and lapis lazuli dazzling the world. German teams under Robert Koldewey uncover Babylon's Ishtar Gate, its blue-glazed bricks bearing striding lions and dragons. The Sumerian language is decoded. The administrative archives of Ur-3 are read, revealing a state of astonishing bureaucratic precision. The Epic of Gilgamesh is assembled in its near-complete form, the oldest literary masterpiece in existence. Yet the legacy runs deeper than museums and translations. The 60-second minute, the 60-minute hour, the 360-degree circle, these derive from the Babylonian sexagesimal number system, still structuring time and geometry worldwide. The 7-day week descends from Mesopotamian astronomical traditions. The zodiac, divided into 12 houses, was first mapped by Babylonian observers. The earliest known legal codes, the concept of written contract, the principle of judicial precedent, all emerge from this soil. The very idea that a society should record its laws in public, accessible to all citizens, begins on a basalt stele in ancient Babylon. Modern Baghdad sits upon layers of older cities. Satellite imagery reveals the ghost traces of ancient canal networks across southern Iraq, their paths still visible from orbit after 5,000 years. The marshlands of the south, home to the marsh Arabs whose reed houses echoed Sumerian architecture into the 20th century, preserve a living connection to the oldest settled communities of the alluvial plain. The world that rose between the Tigris and Euphrates did not merely precede later civilizations, it provided the tools with which they built themselves. Writing, urban planning, codified law, systematic astronomy, literary narrative, institutional religion, imperial administration, each one a Mesopotamian invention carried forward through Persia, Greece, Rome, Islam, and into the foundations of the modern world. The clay tablets, once buried in darkness, now speak across every boundary of language and time. Thank you for following this journey through the first civilization, from its earliest origins to the legacy it left for all of us. If these stories brought the ancient world closer, consider subscribing so future histories find their way to you as well.